100.4 degrees Fahrenheit. 100.4. Read that again. That number was recorded inside the Arctic Circle, in a town where, 4 months earlier, the air was so cold that exposed skin froze in under a minute. Same town, same thermometer, same year. If you grew up believing Siberia was the place where the human body was not supposed to function, that frozen world still exists. The problem is, something else is now living on top of it, and it is rewriting everything we thought we knew about the coldest inhabited place on Earth. What you are about to hear is not a story about climate change. Not really. It is a story about a town that survived a deal it made with the cold for almost 400 years, and just watched the other side of that deal walk away. Verkhoyansk is not a metaphor. It is a real town, about 1,300 people, sitting on a river called the Yana, 675 kilometers north of Yakutsk. Wooden houses on stilts. Wooden churches. Wooden silence. The kind of place where, for almost 2 centuries, the Russian state sent the people it wanted to forget, and it held 2 world records at once. The lowest temperature ever recorded in Asia, minus 67.8 degrees Celsius. And, since 2020, the highest temperature ever verified above the Arctic Circle, 105.8 degrees of spread, in a single town, in a single human lifetime. There is no other place on Earth like that. None. So this video is about 3 things that should not exist together. A town where the ground refuses to thaw, but is thawing. A people who learned to survive cold for 300 years and are now learning to survive heat. And a date, June 20th, 2020, that the residents of Verkhoyansk will remember not as the day it got warm, but as the day the rules changed. First, the cold, because to understand what just broke, you need to understand what existed. An average January day in Verkhoyansk sits at minus 45 degrees Celsius. That is not a record, that is Tuesday. The town has not recorded a single temperature above freezing between November 10th and March 14th in its entire documented history. The ground beneath the houses, the permafrost, has been frozen solid for at least the last 10,000 years, some of it much longer. The buildings stand on stilts, not for decoration. If a heated house touches the ground, the warmth bleeds downward, the permafrost softens, and the building begins to sink, lean, crack. So every wooden home is lifted, like it is afraid of the dirt underneath. Water pipes are wrapped, heated, and run above ground in insulated wooden boxes that snake between buildings like wooden veins. Bury them, and they freeze, split, and explode. Walls are triple thick, windows are tiny, sometimes barely larger than a face. Every entry door has another door behind it, and sometimes a third, to trap pockets of air that slow the cold down by a few precious seconds. When you step outside in January, the first thing that happens is not pain, it is silence. Sound does not carry the same way. Your breath becomes solid, white, immediate, eyelashes locked together. Inside your nose, the moisture freezes against the inner walls, and it feels like glass. And precipitation is almost nothing. The town receives between 150 and 200 millimeters a year. That is desert-level rainfall. Verkhoyansk is, technically, a cold desert. The air is so dry that the cold cuts cleaner. There is no humidity to soften it. The temperature does not feel like winter. It feels like a blade with no edge. And this was the deal Verkhoyansk made with reality. The cold was the price. The cold was also the protection. The cold was the wall. Then the wall broke. Subscribe to Impossible Lands, because what happened next is not a story about climate. It is a story about a town that survived everything, and then watched the one thing it could count on stop being true. If you have ever seen Verkhoyansk in a documentary, you have seen the same images. A man in a fur hat, exhaling steam. A frozen river. A reindeer. A sign that reads, in Cyrillic, the words, Pole of Cold. That is the postcard. That is the story the world tells itself about this place. Here is the part the postcard leaves out. Verkhoyansk was not a town that chose itself. It was founded in 1638 as a Cossack outpost, but for most of the next 3 centuries, it had a quieter, uglier function. It was a place to send people you wanted erased without killing them. From the mid-1800s onward, the Russian Tsarist state used Verkhoyansk as one of the most remote political exile points in the empire. A Polish socialist named Wacław Sieroszewski was banished here from 1891 to 1896 for revolutionary activity. An ethnographer named Ivan Kudyakov arrived in 1866 for publishing folklore the state considered subversive. They were not chained, they did not have to be. The geography was the cage. 900 kilometers of taiga, tundra, and ice in every direction. Where would you run to? The journey itself was the first part of the punishment. Exiles were transported overland from Yakutsk along routes that took months. The weak did not arrive. They died of exposure and privation on the way. In numbers the imperial records were never precise about, because precision was not the point. The point was distance. According to records reviewed by historians of the Siberian exile system, the strategy was openly admitted. The cold did the work, the guards could not. It is estimated that mortality rates at comparable northern exile posts reach 10 to 15% per year, mostly from scurvy, tuberculosis, and exposure. Verkhoyansk was, for almost 100 years, a slow execution pretending to be a sentence. And then came the Soviet century, which inherited the system, expanded it, renamed it, and kept using the same geography. Verkhoyansk continued absorbing people the state wanted absorbed, quietly, into a town whose population never grew because the climate kept editing it. And here is the part nobody puts in the tourist videos. The American journalist George Kennan, who toured the Siberian exile system in the 1880s, wrote that what destroyed prisoners in Verkhoyansk was not the labor, it was the recognition. The moment the prisoner understood that physical rebellion was useless, because the environment itself had already won. To live in Verkhoyansk is to make peace with a list of facts your body refuses to accept. If you spit, the saliva freezes before it hits the ground. Cars are never turned off in winter, because restarting them at -50 is a project. Cattle, when they exist, are kept in deep wooden barns where the manure they produce is a heat source, not a problem. The local diet is brutal in its logic. Reindeer meat, frozen raw fish, shaved into curls and eaten before it has time to thaw, called stroganina, horse fat, butter eaten by the spoon, sugar with everything. The body cannot afford polite calories. Children walk to school in temperatures that would kill an unprepared adult because the schools stay open down to -52. Below that, classes are cancelled, not because it is unsafe, because the school buses cannot start. And buried under all of this, 3 meters down, sometimes deeper, is the ground that does not move. The permafrost. Frozen mammoths have been pulled out of it, almost intact. Wolves, cave lions, bison. The Sakha people, the Yakuts, who have lived in this region for centuries, used to bury their dead shallow because they knew nothing would ever rot. The earth was a freezer that ran for free. And then came June 20th, 2020. The thermometer at the Verkhoyansk meteorological station, which had been operating without interruption since 1885, climbed past 30 degrees Celsius, then 32, then 35. Then it stopped, briefly, at 38.0, 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit. The kind of summer afternoon you would expect in Athens, or Phoenix, or Taipei. Local meteorologists initially refused to publish the number because it sounded like a malfunction. It was not. A weather balloon released that same day confirmed unusually high temperatures throughout the lower atmosphere above the town. The reading held. A year and a half later, in 2021, the World Meteorological Organization, the United Nations Weather Agency, formally verified the temperature. It became the first reading ever to officially hold the title of the highest temperature recorded north of the Arctic Circle. And inside that single number is the second hidden record. The temperature swing of Verkhoyansk, from its lowest verified reading to its highest, is now 105.8 degrees Celsius. No other inhabited place on Earth has a spread of more than 105. Verkhoyansk is alone in that category. Alone. But here is what almost nobody understood when the headlines ran. The story was not the heat. The story was what the heat was doing underneath. The summer of 2020 was not a single hot day. It was a season. Verkhoyansk recorded more than 11 days above 30 degrees Celsius in June alone, in a region where the average June high is closer to 20. The surrounding taiga, dry, exposed, full of dead pine needles that had not seen this much sun in centuries, began to burn. By the middle of July, the wildfire complexes in the Sakha Republic had consumed an area of forest roughly the size of the state of Vermont. The smoke, according to NASA satellite imagery, reached the North Pole. For the first recorded time in history, black carbon from those fires settled on Arctic sea ice, darkening it, and darker ice melts faster. The fire did not stay in Verkhoyansk. The fire changed how the planet reflects light, and below the fire, the permafrost began to give. Russian engineers had assumed, when designing the infrastructure of Siberia, that the frozen ground would behave the way it had behaved for 10,000 years. It is not. According to peer-reviewed studies, the thawing of Russian permafrost is now occurring roughly 70 years ahead of model projections. What does that look like in real life? In 2020, a fuel storage tank near the city of Norilsk collapsed when the permafrost beneath it shifted, releasing approximately 20,000 tons of diesel into Arctic rivers. In Yakutsk, the capital of the Sakha Republic, an entire residential building partially collapsed in 2011 because the ground it stood on softened underneath it. In Verkhoyansk itself, those wooden houses on stilts, the ones designed for permafrost, are now standing on ground that, in some months of the year, is no longer reliably frozen. And then there is what is leaking. Published in the journal Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, a satellite study of the Yenisei-Khatanga Basin in northern Siberia found that the heat wave of 2020 triggered methane releases from a source no one had been monitoring. Not from rotting wetlands, which was expected, from exposed limestone, ancient natural gas trapped under the permafrost for thousands of years, finding cracks in the frozen rock and escaping into the atmosphere. The lead researcher, Nikolaus Freudsheim, a geoscientist at the University of Bonn, described it in surgical terms. The heat made the system unstable. It opened pathways. Gas that had been sealed under frozen ground since before any human civilization existed found its way to the surface, in volumes the models had not anticipated. Methane traps heat between 80 and 86 times more efficiently than carbon dioxide on a 20-year scale. The hotter Siberia gets, the more methane escapes. The more methane escapes, the hotter the planet gets. The more the planet warms, the hotter Siberia gets. Verkhoyansk did not just break a record. Verkhoyansk became part of a feedback loop. And here is the part that should be impossible. The Arctic Circle is now warming at more than twice the global average. The summer of 2020 was supposed to be a freak year. It was not. The pattern continued in 2021, and in the years after, the 30-degree summer days in Verkhoyansk are not anomalies anymore. They are arriving on a schedule. The photographs from that summer are the strangest part. There is a series of images taken by a local resident named Olga Burtseva. In one, children are swimming in a lake outside Verkhoyansk. The water is blue, the sun is high, the sky is cloudless. Without context, you would guess Mediterranean coastline. The context is that the lake is inside the Arctic Circle, in a town whose name means, roughly, the upper river of the cold. In another of her photographs, taken at 11 at night, an outdoor thermometer in Verkhoyansk reads 30 degrees Celsius. The sun is still up, because in June at this latitude, it does not set for weeks. 11 at night, 30 degrees, inside the Arctic Circle. And the people in those pictures are not panicking. They are swimming. They are wearing t-shirts. They are doing what humans do when it is warm. Because the strangest thing about a place that breaks a record like this is not the record. It is that ordinary life continues underneath it. Children swim, old men fish, reindeer herders move their animals. The town keeps being a town. But the silence in those photographs is different from the silence of January. The January silence is sound being absorbed by cold. The June silence is sound being absorbed by something nobody has a name for yet. Older residents, when interviewed, describe it the same way, again and again. The air smells different. The mosquitoes arrive earlier. The frost in the morning when it forms is thinner. The ice on the Yana River breaks up sooner each year. None of these are records. None of them make headlines. But all of them, together, mean that the town no longer knows what month it is. The reindeer herders of the surrounding region, mostly Sakha and Evenki families, are reporting that the migration routes their grandparents used are no longer reliable. The animals are reading a landscape that no longer matches the one inside their genetic memory. Calves are being born into weather their species was not built for. Pastures that were tundra a generation ago are becoming bog. Bog does not feed reindeer. Bog drowns them. But the wooden boxes that carry the water pipes are starting to warp. The graves of the exiles, the ones the Tsars sent here to die slowly in ground that would never rot, are no longer in ground that will never rot. The mammoths that the permafrost preserved for 10,000 years are now being pulled from the earth, not by archaeologists, but by erosion. The Yana River is changing its banks faster than the maps can be updated. Verkhoyansk survived the cold for almost 400 years. It built itself around the cold. It buried its dead in the cold. It chose its food, its houses, its clothing, its entire civilization for the cold. The cold was the one fact that nobody, in the entire history of this town, ever questioned. It was not a climate. It was an axiom. Everything else, the houses, the diet, the burial customs, the school calendar, the engineering, the language for distance, the language for time, the language for survival, all of it was built downstream of the assumption that the cold was permanent. The cold was never the threat. The cold was the deal, and the deal is breaking. So here is the question. When the coldest inhabited place on Earth records the hottest day in the history of the Arctic, what exactly are the rest of us supposed to do with the maps we drew before that happened? Subscribe, hit the bell, and I'll see you on Impossible Lands.